Frank's first professional audition lasted exactly 4 minutes before they stopped him and said, "That's enough." But what happened in the parking lot afterward created a legend. It was September 18th, 1939, and 23-year-old Frank Sinatra was sitting in a borrowed Chevy in the parking lot of Columbia Records in New York City. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel. He'd been sitting there for 45 minutes, trying to build up the courage to walk through that door. Frank had been dreaming about this moment for years. Columbia Records was where the magic happened, where Bing Crosby had made it, where real singers became stars. But getting to this audition had been a battle. Frank had grown up in Hoboken, New Jersey, the only child of Italian immigrants. His father, Marty, was a firefighter who thought singing was a waste of time. "Get a real job," Marty would say. "Music is for dreamers and fools." But Frank's mama, Dolly, was different. She was a force of nature, a midwife and political operative who ran their neighborhood like a benevolent dictator, and she believed in her son's voice. "You got something special, Francis," she'd tell him. "Don't let nobody tell you different." Dolly had scraped together money they didn't have to buy Frank a portable PA system so he could sing at local clubs. She'd used her political connections to get him gigs. She'd even gotten him on Major Beau's Amateur Hour in 1935, where he and the Hoboken Four had won first prize. But winning amateur shows and getting a real recording contract were two different things. Frank had been singing at the Rustic Cabin, a roadhouse in New Jersey, for almost a year. 75 cents a night, plus whatever tips he could charm out of customers. He'd sing 4 or 5 sets a night, practicing his phrasing, perfecting that intimate style that felt more like conversation than performance. Nancy Barbado, his girlfriend, they'd get married in 1939, would come to hear him sing whenever she could. She'd sit at the bar and watch him work the room, connecting with people in a way that seemed almost magical. "You're going to be a star, Frank," she'd tell him. "Yeah, well, stars need record contracts," Frank would reply, "and I can't even get a call back." He'd been rejected by RCA, rejected by Decca, rejected by Brunswick. Each time the answer was the same. Too different, too soft, not commercial enough. The Columbia audition was his last real shot. If Jack Kapp said no, Frank didn't know where else to turn. But Frank was terrified. He'd done amateur shows. He'd sung with the Hoboken Four. He'd even won on Major Beau's Amateur Hour. But this was different. This was the music business, the real music business. And Frank was just a kid from Hoboken with a dream and a voice he wasn't even sure was good enough. Finally, at 2:47 p.m., Frank forced himself out of the car. He'd borrowed his cousin's good suit for this. His mama Dolly had pressed his shirt so many times the collar could cut glass. His hair was slicked back with enough pomade to waterproof a boat. He grabbed his sheet music from the passenger seat and walked toward the door before he could change his mind. Inside Columbia Records, a receptionist named Helen was manning the front desk. She was Jack Kapp's assistant and the person who handled most of the walk-in auditions. Helen had heard hundreds of hopefuls come through that door, and she could usually tell within 30 seconds whether someone had potential or was wasting her time. Frank walked in and immediately felt out of place. The walls were covered with photos of real singers, people who'd made records, people who mattered. And here he was, just a kid who sang at a roadhouse in New Jersey. "Can I help you?" Helen asked, looking up from her paperwork. Frank cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. I'd like to audition. I mean, if Mr. Kapp is hearing people today." Helen studied him for a moment. He looked nervous enough to throw up, but there was something about his intensity that caught her attention. "What kind of music do you sing?" "Ballads, mostly, ma'am. Love songs. Standards. I can do up-tempo too, whatever you need." "Who do you sound like?" Frank hesitated. This was the question that always tripped him up. "I don't sound like nobody, ma'am. I just sound like me." Helen had heard that answer before from singers who couldn't carry a tune, but something about the way Frank said it, with equal parts pride and fear, made her curious. "Mr. Kapp is in the studio right now, but I can have you do a test recording. If he likes what he hears, he might call you back for a real contract discussion." Frank's heart jumped. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." Helen led him down a narrow hallway to a small recording room. A piano player was already there, a tired-looking man in his 50s who'd probably accompanied 1,000 auditions. "What are you going to sing?" Helen asked. "Night and Day," Frank said. "Cole Porter. It's my best song. All right, when you're ready." The piano player started the intro and Frank began to sing. His voice came out shaky at first, nervous and unsure, but then something happened. He closed his eyes and forgot about the recording equipment, forgot about Helen watching him, forgot about everything except the song. His voice found its groove, that unique sound,
lighter than the big band singers, more intimate than the crooners, with a vulnerability that didn't quite sound like anyone else. Helen's eyebrows raised. This kid didn't sound like Bing Crosby. He didn't sound like Russ Columbo. He sounded like something different, something she'd never quite heard before. Frank made it through the first verse and was heading into the second when the door to the recording room suddenly opened. Jack Kapp walked in, looking annoyed. "Helen, what's—" Jack stopped when he saw Frank at the microphone. "Just doing a test recording," Helen said.
"This is—" She realized she didn't know his name. "Frank Sinatra, sir," Frank said, his heart sinking. He could tell from Jack's expression that this interruption meant the audition was over. Jack crossed his arms and stared at Frank for a long moment. "Play me something else, something up-tempo." Frank's hands were shaking. He looked at the piano player who shrugged and asked, "What do you know?" "All or Nothing at All," Frank said. It was an upbeat Harry James arrangement he'd been practicing. He sang it with every ounce of energy he had, pouring his whole soul into those 4 minutes. But exactly 4 minutes in, Jack held up his hand. "That's enough." Frank stopped mid-verse, his heart plummeting into his stomach. "That's enough." The words every auditioner dreads. Jack looked at Helen, then back at Frank. "Son, what are you trying to do here?" "Sir? What kind of music are you trying to make? Because what I just heard was—" Jack paused, searching for words. "It's weak. You're singing like you're talking to one person in a bedroom, not performing for a crowd. You can't do that on records." Frank felt his face burning. "I just sing what I feel, sir." "Well, what you feel isn't commercially viable," Jack said bluntly. "This is the big band era. People want power. They want volume. They want excitement. What you're doing is too quiet, too intimate. Nobody's going to pay money to hear a guy whisper love songs into a microphone." Helen started to speak up, but Jack was on a roll. "And that vibrato, it's too much. You sound nervous, uncertain. People want confidence from a singer. They want someone who sounds like they know what they're doing." Frank stood there, feeling every word like a punch to the gut. "My advice," Jack continued, "stick to local clubs. You've got a nice little style for roadhouses and wedding gigs, but you'll never make it on records. You're too soft, too Italian-sounding, too different. The market won't support it." "Yes, sir," Frank whispered. "Thank you for your time." Frank walked out of that recording room, through the front office, and out to the borrowed car. He made it about 30 feet into the parking lot before the tears started. He sat in that Chevy, crying so hard he could barely breathe, still clutching his sheet music. Everything Jack Kapp had said echoed in his head. Too soft, too weak, too different. Stick to local clubs. Frank had spent years believing he had something special. His mama had told him he was destined for greatness. Nancy, his girlfriend, had said his voice was unique. But now a real professional, someone who actually knew the music business, had told him the truth. He wasn't good enough. He'd never be good enough. Frank cried in that parking lot for nearly 2 hours. He watched the sun start to set, watched other people come and go from Columbia Records, watched his dreams crumble into dust. Then something shifted. Frank wiped his eyes and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked like hell. Eyes red, face blotchy, hair messed up from running his hands through it. But underneath all that, he saw something else. He saw his mama's face when she'd bought him that first microphone with money she didn't have. He saw Nancy's face when she'd told him to chase this dream. He saw every person who'd ever believed in him, and Frank got angry. Jack Kapp had said he was too different. Well, maybe being different was exactly what the world needed. Jack said he sang like he was talking to one person. Well, maybe that's exactly what people wanted to hear. Frank started the car and drove straight home to Hoboken. He found his mama in the kitchen, and she took one look at his face and knew something had happened. "Francis, what's wrong?" "I auditioned at Columbia Records today," Frank said. "Jack Kapp told me to stick to local clubs, said my voice was too soft, too intimate, said I'd never make it on records." Dolly pulled her son into a fierce hug. "That man don't know everything. Mama, he's Jack Kapp. He knows the music business. If he says I'm not good enough—" "Francis Albert Sinatra, you listen to me." Dolly grabbed his face in her hands. "That man told you that you don't fit into the boxes he knows. That's his limitation, not yours. You're not supposed to fit into their boxes. You're supposed to build your own." Frank pulled away, frustrated. "Mama, you don't understand. He's right. I sing too soft for the big band era. I don't have the power that people want. I don't sound like anybody else, and that's not a good thing in the music business. That's exactly why it's a good thing.
Dolly insisted. Francis, there are a million singers who sound like everybody else. The world don't need another Bing Crosby. The world needs someone who sounds like nobody else. The world needs you. Frank wanted to believe her, but Jack Kapp's words were still fresh in his mind. Listen to me, Dolly continued, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. You know why that man told you to stick to local clubs? Because he's scared. He's scared of something new. He's scared of something he don't understand. And when people are scared, they try to make you small so they feel big. But Mama, no buts. You think Bing Crosby sounded like anybody before him? You think Al Jolson fit into some box? No, they made their own way, and you're going to make yours. She grabbed his hands across the table. I didn't raise you to fit into somebody else's idea of what a singer should be. I raised you to be Francis Albert Sinatra, not a copy of somebody else. You. Frank felt tears coming again, but this time they were different. Not tears of defeat, but tears of determination. I'm going to tell you something else, Dolly said. You remember when you were 8 years old and the other kids made fun of the way you talked? Said you sounded too fancy? Frank nodded.
And what did you do? I kept talking the same way. Damn right you did, because you knew who you were even then. You're not going to change now just because some record man don't understand what you got. She stood up and started making coffee, her way of signaling that the emotional part of the conversation was over and it was time to get practical. Here's what you're going to do, she said. Tomorrow, you're going back to the rustic cabin. You're going to sing like you always sing, and you're going to keep singing until somebody with ears in their head recognizes what you got. And if nobody does, Dolly turned and looked at him with those fierce eyes that had intimidated Hoboken politicians and neighborhood toughs for decades. Then you make them listen. You don't wait for permission to be great, Francis. You just be great, and eventually they got no choice but to notice. Frank sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Mama, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Keep getting rejected. Keep being told I'm not good enough. Yes, you can, Dolly said firmly. And you know why? Because every time somebody tells you no, you're going to use that as fuel. You're going to prove them wrong. That's what strong people do. They turn pain into power. That night, Frank made a decision. He took his last dollar and bought a small notebook. On the first page, he wrote down exactly what Jack Kapp had said. Too soft, too intimate, too different. Stick to local clubs. Then, underneath those words, Frank wrote his own response. I'll show you what different can do. Over the next few months, Frank didn't give up. He kept singing at the rustic cabin. He kept practicing. He kept developing that unique, intimate style that Jack Kapp had dismissed as commercially unviable. And then, in June 1939, something happened. Harry James, the famous trumpet player who was starting his own big band, came to the rustic cabin looking for a male vocalist. He'd heard about this skinny kid from Hoboken with an unusual voice. Harry listened to Frank sing one song, All or Nothing at All, and offered him a contract on the spot, $75 a week. You've got something different, kid, Harry said, and different is exactly what I'm looking for. Frank almost told Harry about Jack Kapp's Rejection, but he kept his mouth shut and smiled. The Harry James Orchestra recording of All or Nothing at All was released in August 1939. It didn't sell much at first, but Frank's intimate, conversational style started getting noticed. In January 1940, Tommy Dorsey, one of the biggest band leaders in America, heard Frank sing and offered him a job, $125 a week, more money than Frank had ever imagined. Within a year, Frank Sinatra was the most popular vocalist in America. Within 5 years, he was the biggest star in the country. By 1943, he was causing riots at the Paramount Theater. Girls screaming, fainting, throwing themselves at the stage. The intimate style that Jack Kapp had called too soft became Frank's signature. While other singers bellowed at their audiences, Frank sang to them, making every person in a 20,000-seat arena feel like he was singing directly to them. The vibrato that Jack had called too nervous became the emotional vulnerability that made Bobby Soxers cry and made grown men remember their first loves. The Italian quality that had been called too ethnic became part of Frank's charm, that working-class authenticity that separated him from the polished, distant stars of the previous era. Everything Jack Kapp had said was wrong became the exact reason Frank was right. By 1945, Frank Sinatra was the most famous entertainer in America. He'd made over 200 recordings. He'd starred in movies. He'd sold out Carnegie Hall. He was earning more money than he'd ever imagined possible. And Columbia Records, they came calling in 1943, offering Frank a solo contract. The same company that had rejected him 4 years earlier now wanted to make him the centerpiece of their catalog. They offered him creative control, top producers, unlimited studio time, everything they'd refused to even consider in 1939. The contract was worth $250,000 over 5 years, more money than Jack Kapp had probably made in his entire career. During the contract negotiations, Jack Kapp, who'd moved to Decca but was consulting on the deal, pulled Frank aside. "You know what's funny?" Jack said. "I almost let you slip away. When you came in for that audition back in 1939, I told you to stick to local clubs. You remember that?" Frank pulled out his wallet and showed Jack the small notebook he still carried. On the first page were Jack's words about being too soft, followed by Frank's response about proving him wrong. "I remember, Mr. Kapp. I remember every word you said." Jack looked at that notebook and shook his head. "Frank, I was wrong. Dead wrong. You weren't too soft. I was too deaf to hear what you were doing. That intimate style, singing like you're talking to one person, that's what people wanted all along. I just couldn't see it." "It's okay, Mr. Kapp," Frank said. "You taught me something important that day." "What's that?" "That when someone tells you you're too different to succeed, they're really telling you they're too limited to understand. And that's not your problem. It's theirs." Frank kept that notebook for the rest of his life. He'd pull it out whenever he felt discouraged or when someone told him he couldn't do something. Years later, when Frank's career hit rock bottom in the early 1950s, when his voice failed, when Columbia dropped him, when Ava Gardner left him, he'd look at that notebook and remember September 18th, 1939. He'd remember sitting in that parking lot, crying, believing his career was over before it started. And he'd remember his mama's words, "You don't wait for permission to be great. You just be great." That's what got him through. That's what made him fight for the role in From Here to Eternity when everyone said he was finished. That's what made him come back stronger than ever in the 1950s and 60s. The rejection became his fuel. Every no became a reason to work harder. Every person who doubted him became someone he'd prove wrong. And that notebook, that small record of the day someone told him he wasn't good enough, became the most valuable thing he owned. Not the Grammy Awards, not the Oscar, not the gold records or the sold-out concerts at Madison Square Garden. That notebook, that reminder that rejection isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Jack Kapp's rejection in September 1939 could have ended Frank's career before it started. Instead, it became the fuel that drove him to prove everyone wrong. The man who told Frank he was too soft to make records ended up watching him become the most successful singer in history, but only after Frank refused to believe that being different was a weakness. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to us is having someone tell us we'll never make it, because that's when we find out what we're really made of. That's when we discover whether we believe in ourselves more than we believe in their limitations. Frank was told to stick to local clubs. Instead, he sang his way past every person who doubted him and changed music history forever.